Okay, so we're diving into a really tense situation that's happening right now in Gaza.
Yeah,
We're going to be looking at this healthcare crisis that's unfolding in the middle of a conflict zone.
right.
And things have just gotten even worse because Kamal Adwan Hospital,
Yeah.
the last major hospital in the north, has had to be evacuated and closed.
It really is. It's a terrible situation that highlights the humanitarian crisis that we've been seeing unfold in Gaza
Right.
for over 14 months.
We're going deep on this one today, looking at reports from the Washington Post, the Sunday Times, and the Guardian.
Okay.
Those sources give us kind of a couple of different perspectives on this situation. It's a complex one. Um, and we're aiming to kind of give you a clear picture of what's happening right now with healthcare in Gaza and how we got to this point where this hospital's been shut down.
Right. To really understand what's going on and how serious it is, I think it's important to look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
This conflict between Israel and Hamas, it's created a truly devastating humanitarian crisis. The Gaza Health Ministry, they say that over 45,000 Palestinians have died in Gaza,
Wow.
and most of them, tragically, have been women and children.
And then on top of that, you have this incredible displacement.
Right.
90% of the population,
It's a huge number.
which is 1.9 million people,
Yeah.
have been displaced.
Yeah.
And so many of them have been forced to move south. It's hard to even imagine what that must be like.
Right.
So Kamal Adwan Hospital, this is one of the few places left in northern Gaza where people could get help before it had to be evacuated.
Yeah.
The IDF raided the hospital. They
Yeah.
said it was being used by Hamas.
Well, they did.
And during that raid, they detained the director of the hospital, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, who they suspected of being a Hamas operative.
Right.
The evacuation was chaotic.
Yeah.
350 people had to leave, including 75 patients and 185 members of the medical staff. The patients were taken to the Indonesian hospital, but that wasn't even functional at the time. And to make things even more confusing, there was a fire at the hospital. Hamas says the IDF started it, but the IDF denies any involvement. So it's just this extra layer of uncertainty on top of an already really, really tense situation.
Right.
So the World Health Organization's come out and said that this raid basically put the last major healthcare facility in North Gaza out of service.
It did.
So it's a devastating blow to a healthcare system that was already in really bad shape.
Right.
Just trying to imagine the desperation of people who need medical care in Gaza right now, especially in the north.
That's terrible.
I mean, even before they had to evacuate Kamal Adwan, healthcare system was already under immense strain.
Absolutely.
By December 4th, the World Health Organization reported that only 17 hospitals out of 32 were still working.
Right.
And only 50 out of 136 primary healthcare facilities were operating.
Yeah.
So the facilities that are left are just completely overwhelmed.
They are, and they're running out of supplies.
Wow.
It's a very, very difficult situation, particularly for vulnerable people like pregnant women.
Right.
There are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza at the moment. 5,500 of them are expected to give birth next month.
Gosh.
And then you've also got 1,500 people who need dialysis. So the need for healthcare is urgent. It really is a race against time for a lot of people.
So this raid on Kamal Adwan,
Right.
this wasn't just an isolated event.
No, it wasn't.
This is part of a bigger pattern of Israeli military operations in northern Gaza that have been going on since October 5th.
You're right. The IDF has said that their objective is to get rid of the Hamas militants who have regrouped in the north.
Okay.
And their actions have led to a massive displacement of people. Over 100,000 Palestinians have had to leave their homes in the north. And it's thought that there are only between 30,000 and 50,000 people still there.
Wow.
So it's a huge exodus.
And as if that's not bad enough, Israel has also put really severe restrictions on aid getting into Gaza.
They have.
And experts are really worried about a famine.
Yes.
It's a very, very worrying situation.
So Israel has given reasons for the raid on the hospital.
Right.
They say that there was a Hamas command center inside Kamal Adwan.
Good.
And they also allege that Hamas operatives were using the hospital, basically using the patients and the staff as human shields.
Wow.
But the IDF insists that they only go after military targets.
Right.
And that they take steps to minimize harm to civilians, which includes issuing those evacuation orders. They also say that accusations of ethnic cleansing are completely false,
Right.
and that their operations are all in line with international law. It's really complicated because you have these conflicting accounts,
Right.
and it's hard to work out exactly what happened. It's
Yeah.
really important to look at all sides of this.
Right.
And the international community has had a strong reaction to what's happening. The UN has condemned the fact that the conflict's escalating, and the World Health Organization has said it's really urgent that all healthcare facilities are protected. They're also going to be having a meeting of the UN Security Council
Okay.
to talk about the situation.
And to show how seriously people are taking these allegations against Israel, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for both Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. So it's clear that what's happening is being watched very, very closely by the international community.
Absolutely. And this conflict has also brought up some really interesting but worrying uses of technology. The Washington Post did an investigation into how Israel is using artificial intelligence in war.
Oh, wow.
Specifically, they're using a system called the Gospel.
Okay.
So this Gospel system lets them identify targets really quickly.
Yeah.
And it's thought that this is one of the reasons why we've seen so many strikes in Gaza. There are big concerns about using AI in war.
Right.
People are worried that it could lead to more civilian casualties and that there's not enough transparency in how decisions are being made.
Right.
So it's definitely something that needs to be looked at more closely.
Yeah, definitely. This is a new area, really, isn't it? Using AI in warfare.
It is. And there are lots of ethical and legal questions that need to be answered.
Yeah.
One of the things that's especially worrying is that there could be bias in these systems and a lack of accountability when they're used in conflict zones.
This is just the start of our look into this really complex situation. We'll be back to try and untangle more of it in the next part of our deep dive.
Right. It's just unbelievable the scale of the destruction in northern Gaza.
Yeah.
We've seen reports and pictures from the Washington Post, and it's really grim.
Right.
This isn't just about a few specific targets. We're talking about whole neighborhoods being completely wiped out.
It's hard to even imagine that level of destruction. The Washington Post did an analysis of satellite imagery, and it seems like Israel isn't just targeting military installations. It looks like they're systematically demolishing residential areas.
Yeah.
And then they're building military fortifications in their place. It's incredible. To give you an idea of the scale of this, look at the Jabalia refugee camp.
Right.
Between October 14th and December 15th, almost half of it was either demolished or cleared out.
Wow.
What they've done is they've basically created a military corridor by connecting existing roads and really heavily fortifying the area. It's really similar to what Israel did with the Netzarim corridor in the central Gaza Strip.
So for people who might not know about the Netzarim corridor, that was a heavily guarded strip of land that Israel controlled. It cut right through the Gaza Strip.
Right.
And it caused a lot of disruption to Palestinian life and movement for years.
Absolutely. And the difference this time is that this new corridor goes right through areas that are really densely populated.
Right.
It's like they've wiped out entire Palestinian cities in the north.
It's hard to understand how this could be considered a proportionate response.
Mm-hmm.
It really raises questions about whether civilian areas are being deliberately targeted.
It does.
It's a really grim reality. According to the UN, over 100,000 Palestinians have been displaced from these areas in the north.
Right.
And only an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 people are left.
It's a tragedy.
And that's on top of the 1.9 million people who were already displaced across Gaza. It's just impossible to imagine the impact on all these people.
It really is. People are losing their homes, they're losing loved ones, and they're facing this humanitarian crisis with very little access to aid.
Right.
The UN has said that hardly any aid has reached the north since early October
Well,
because of the restrictions that Israel has put in place. Experts are saying that there could be a famine soon. It's really worrying. When you have this deliberate denial of aid, and so many people have been forced from their homes, it's a recipe for disaster.
and it's not just about basic supplies. Some of the residents who managed to get out of the north have been talking about what it was like. The Washington Post interviewed a few people, and they described really terrifying evacuation conditions. They talked about being separated from their families and facing abuse and being detained by Israeli forces for no reason. It's just awful to hear these stories.
It is. Now, it's important to remember that Israel says they're only targeting military objectives
Right.
and that they're doing what they can to protect civilians.
Okay.
They say these evacuation orders are for the Palestinians' own safety, but the things that people told the Washington Post
Right.
paint a very different picture.
Yeah.
It seems like they aren't really considering civilian safety at all. It's really hard to reconcile these two versions of events.
It makes you question Israel's reasons for these operations. When you look at the scale of the destruction, the fact that residential areas are being targeted, the restrictions on aid, and the way evacuees have been treated, it all points to something more aggressive than just trying to get rid of Hamas militants. It's such a complicated and sensitive issue. It's really important to try to understand all the different points of view.
Absolutely. You have Israel, who feels that what they're doing is justified because of the threat from Hamas.
Right.
And then you have the international community, who are trying to deal with the devastating impact all of this is having on the Palestinians. It's not easy to navigate these different perspectives. It's not about choosing sides, but trying to understand how complex and nuanced the situation really is.
And that's what we're trying to do here. We're looking at information from different sources, including sources that might challenge the main narrative. Hopefully, this can help us understand this incredibly complex situation in a more balanced and informed way.
Exactly. We're not here to give you easy answers or tell you what to think. We want to give you the knowledge and context so you can form your own opinions. The situation in Gaza is much too complicated to be seen as just black and white, good versus evil.
Right.
It's a messy, tragic situation, and we need to carefully consider and try to understand the perspectives of everyone involved.
One thing that's clear is that this conflict is having a huge humanitarian cost. And the international community has a responsibility to do something,
Absolutely.
to make sure that anyone who's violated international law is held accountable, and to push for a peaceful solution. This is a global issue, and it needs a global response.
And it's not just about governments and organizations. We all have a responsibility as individuals.
Right.
We can't just stand by and watch this happen. We have to stay engaged, educate ourselves, and speak up for peace and justice for everyone who's caught in the middle of this. We can't stay silent while people are suffering.
I agree. But what can we actually do? Apart from raising awareness, I mean.
Yeah.
What can we do to make a real difference? It often feels like we're just tiny voices that can't be heard in the middle of all this global politics.
I know what you mean, but even small actions can have an impact. We can support humanitarian organizations that are working on the ground.
Right.
We can contact our elected officials and tell them what we think. And we can talk about the conflict with people in our own communities in a way that's informed and respectful.
You're right. Every voice matters.
It does.
And if we all stay informed and engaged, we can together make the call for peace and justice in Gaza louder. It's going to be a long and difficult road,
That is.
but we can't lose hope.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about the terrible things that have happened because of this conflict.
Yeah.
But it's important to think about what led to this point, too. The roots of this conflict go way, way back.
They really do. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really complicated. It's all these historical grievances and political disagreements and worries about security all mixed up together. And it's been going on for generations.
Right.
There aren't any easy solutions.
Yeah.
And the situation right now in Gaza just shows how complicated it is.
It's clear from what we've been reading that Israel sees what it's doing as a response to the threat from Hamas. They talk about the attack on October 7th as the reason they're carrying out these military operations.
Yeah.
But it just feels like we're stuck in this cycle of violence that never ends. Both sides seem to believe they're right and that their actions are justified.
It's a cycle that has been repeating for decades, really.
Yeah.
And it's had terrible consequences for both Israelis and Palestinians. There's no real peace process. And the fact that Israeli settlements keep expanding in the West Bank just makes Palestinians more resentful. And it makes groups like Hamas stronger. And then Israel feels more and more threatened and isolated, which makes them take a harder line and use more aggressive military tactics. It's really dangerous.
So what happens now? Is there any chance of a peaceful solution? Or are we just going to see more suffering, destruction? It's a really heavy question for all of us watching this unfold.
It's the big question, isn't it? Things look really bad, but I do think there's always hope, even in the darkest times. I think the first step, and maybe the most important one, is to remember that everyone involved is human. Palestinians are going through such terrible suffering, but we can't forget about the fear and trauma that Israelis are experiencing too. To have a lasting peace, both sides need to recognize and understand each other's pain and perspectives.
That's so important.
It is.
It's easy to get caught up in all the political arguments and forget that real people are being hurt by this conflict. Behind all the headlines and numbers, there are families, people with hopes and dreams, who are caught in the middle of this.
Exactly. We need to move past this idea that it's good versus evil. We need to remember that both Israelis and Palestinians are human. It's not about one side being right and the other wrong. It's about understanding how we got to this point, all the complicated history and politics, and then working towards a future where both sides can live together peacefully and safely.
That's really powerful. But how do we actually make that happen? What can we do to stop this cycle of violence and create a situation where peace can last? It feels overwhelming sometimes.
It does. It's going to take a lot of different things. We need the international community to put strong and consistent pressure on both sides to stop fighting and start talking to each other.
Mhm.
We need to deal with the things that are causing the conflict, like settlements and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. These are really tough issues with no easy answers, but they have to be dealt with if we want any chance of peace.
It's a huge task. But we know from history that peace is possible, even in the most difficult situations. There have been moments of hope in the past. Agreements have been made, and there have been times when things were relatively calm. Those moments remind us that even in the darkest times, people can overcome these challenges.
And that's what we need to hold on to, that belief, that peace is possible, that talking to each other can be more powerful than violence, and that a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace is something worth fighting for.
We started this deep dive by looking at the awful situation at Kamal Adwan Hospital.
Right.
It's a small but powerful example of the bigger crisis happening in Gaza. We've gone deep into how complicated this conflict is, how badly civilians are being affected, and how hard it seems to find a way to peace. It's been a heavy and emotional journey.
It really has. It's a lot to take in, and there aren't any easy answers. But I hope that by taking this deep dive, you have a better understanding of the conflict, and even more importantly, that you feel like you need to do something. We can't ignore this.
Absolutely not.
What's happening in Gaza needs our attention, our empathy, and our action.
Yeah.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and peaceful future, whether it's by supporting humanitarian work, advocating for policy changes, or even just having thoughtful conversations about what's happening. Every little thing can make a difference.
The future of Gaza and the whole region really depends on all of us working together for peace. It's a responsibility we all share.